You'd think a man could trust his own body. For 15 years, I thought I knew mine well enough. Never been the gym rat type, but healthy enough to keep up with my daughters, Grace and Emily, during their weekend soccer games. So when I started feeling that persistent burning sensation, I chalked it up to one too many late-night coffees or maybe some new medication side effect. But when it didn't go away, when it got worse, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. That's how I ended up at the clinic, under the sterile glare of fluorescent lights, sitting across from a doctor who didn't look much older than Grace. He wore an expression I couldn't read, his words precise but still carrying that dreadful pause between sentences. "Matthew, your test results came back positive for gonorrhea." Gonorrhea. The word hung in the air, twisting like a dagger in my gut. I almost laughed. It had to be a mistake, right? Me? Gonorrhea? Are you sure? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There must be some mix-up. My wife and I, Fiona, we've been married for 15 years. I've never. He held up his hand, almost like he was calming a child. I understand this might be difficult to hear, but the results are conclusive. Conclusive. There was no room for misunderstanding. It felt like the floor had opened beneath me, and I was free falling into some cruel, alternate reality. This wasn't supposed to happen to me. Not to us. Fiona and I had built a life together. A home filled with laughter, 2 beautiful daughters, and the kind of love story people envied. I left the clinic in a daze. The drive home felt endless, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. Was it possible the test was wrong? Or worse, was Fiona? No. I shook my head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She wouldn't. Not Fiona. She was my partner, my confidant, the woman who still left little notes in my lunchbox, who sang off-key in the shower every morning. The thought of her being unfaithful was impossible, or at least it had been until now. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I realized I couldn't even walk through the front door without feeling the weight of suspicion pressing on my chest. I sat in the car, staring at the house where we'd raised our daughters, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. It felt different now, foreign, like every memory I cherished was suddenly tainted. Fiona greeted me at the door, her smile as warm as ever. "You're late," she teased, pecking my cheek. "Dinner's in the oven. The girls are upstairs doing homework." I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. "Yeah, I got held up." She didn't seem to notice my hesitation, but I could feel the cracks forming between us, cracks I didn't even know existed until today. My stomach churned as I followed her into the kitchen, her laughter ringing hollow in my ears. I tried to act normal, but every glance, every touch felt like a test. Was she hiding something? Did her smile falter? Did she look guilty? Or was I just imagining it? Later that night, as Fiona slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying the doctor's words. The truth was, I didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything I thought was solid and unshakable now felt like sand slipping through my fingers. The thought gnawed at me, whispering in the dark. What if Fiona isn't the woman you think she is? I turned to look at her, her face peaceful in sleep. 15 years of trust, of love, of shared dreams. Could it all be a lie? I didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt was planted, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew this was just the beginning. Here's the expansion of the second chapter, uncovering the truth from Matthew's point of view. Once the seed of doubt takes root, it's impossible to stop it from growing. That night at the clinic had shattered the foundation of my reality. Every smile Fiona gave me, every casual touch, felt like a question mark instead of a period. I couldn't confront her outright, not yet. I needed answers, cold hard facts. But how do you go about investigating the person you've shared your life with? At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it really was a mistake at the clinic, some fluke of biology that didn't involve betrayal. But the unease didn't fade. It only grew. The next morning, as Fiona made pancakes in the kitchen, humming to herself, I caught myself watching her too closely. Was that her normal smile? Or was there something forced about it? Was she hiding something? Or was I losing my mind? I hated this version of myself, suspicious, doubtful, desperate for a truth I wasn't even sure existed. But the thought of ignoring it, of letting this fester unchecked, was worse. The first step was subtle. Fiona had always been protective of her phone, a quirk I'd chalked up to her preference for privacy. But now, it felt like a red flag. I started paying attention. How she'd angle the screen away when texting, how she'd leave the room to take certain calls. My heart sank every time I noticed it. One evening, while she was in the shower, I saw her phone sitting on the nightstand. My hand shook as I reached for it, half expecting her to burst out of the bathroom at any moment. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Texts, photos, anything. But her phone was locked, and I didn't know the passcode. It was another wall between us, one I didn't know how to climb. That's when I realized I needed help. If I was going to uncover the truth, I couldn't do it alone. The lawyer came first. I scheduled a consultation under the guise of discussing a routine financial matter. It felt surreal, sitting across from a stranger, laying out my suspicions like pieces of a broken puzzle. He listened quietly, his expression neutral, before finally nodding. "If you're serious about this, you might want to hire a private investigator," he said. The idea made my stomach churn. It felt invasive, wrong, like a betrayal of my own. But then I thought about that clinic visit, about the gnawing doubt that wouldn't leave me alone. I realized this wasn't about punishing Fiona or proving her guilt. It was about preserving my sanity. The investigator was a wiry man named Ian, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You'd be surprised how common this is," he said when I hesitated. "You want the truth, right? That's what I'll find for you." The arrangement was simple. Ian would follow Fiona, track her movements, and report back with anything unusual. It felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, but once the ball was rolling, I couldn't stop it. In the meantime, I started digging on my own. Fiona had always handled most of our finances, another habit I'd never questioned. But now, I combed through our bank statements, looking for anomalies. That's when I found it. A bank account I didn't recognize, with regular deposits and withdrawals I couldn't trace. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. Fiona had always been meticulous about our finances, down to the last cent. So why was there an account I didn't know about? And why did the transactions feel so personal? Dinners at upscale restaurants, luxury spa visits, things we'd never indulged in together. When Ian called me a few days later, my heart pounded in my chest. "You were right to call me," he said. "There's something you need to see." I didn't want to see it, not really, but I knew I had to. The path I'd started down wasn't one I could back out of now. Whatever Ian had uncovered, it would either shatter my doubts or confirm my worst fears. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. The truth was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The call from Ian felt like the beginning of the end. "I have what you're looking for," he said. His voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the undertone of pity. People like him didn't deliver good news. His job was to uncover the ugly truths, and by the sound of it, he'd found mine. We met at a small coffee shop far from home. Ian walked in carrying a manila folder, his expression neutral but knowing. He handed it over without a word, and I hesitated before opening it, my fingers trembling against the clasp. I wasn't ready. Who could be ready for this? When I finally opened the folder, the first thing that caught my eye was a photo. Fiona. My Fiona. She was sitting at a restaurant, leaning in close to a man I didn't recognize. Her smile was radiant, but not in the way I knew. This wasn't the warm, loving smile she gave me or the playful one she shared with our daughters. This was different, flirty, intimate. My stomach twisted. "I followed her for a week," Ian said, breaking the silence. This was the first guy. The first guy. I flipped through the photos, each one like a stab to the chest. Fiona walking into a hotel with another man, holding hands with someone else at a park. Different faces, different places. The final pages of the folder contained text messages and emails Ian had somehow accessed. I didn't even want to know how. I skimmed the messages, my heart sinking with every line. The things she said to these men, intimate, personal things, made my skin crawl. But it was one particular email that broke me. She had written to her boss, a man I now recognized from one of the photos. She told him about her plans to leave me once Grace and Emily graduated. She called our marriage a convenience. a facade she maintained for the sake of appearances. "I'll leave him when the time is right," she wrote. "For now, he's just there. Just there." 15 years, and that's how she saw me. Not a partner, not a man she once loved, but a placeholder. My hands clenched the folder as I fought back the urge to throw it across the table. Ian cleared his throat. "There's more." "More?" I didn't think I could take more. But he pulled out a small device and played an audio recording. Fiona's voice filled the air, laughing with someone. A man, by the sound of it. "He has no idea," she said, her tone mocking. "I can't wait to finally be free of him." The laughter that followed was hers, but it felt like a stranger's. It wasn't the Fiona I knew. Or maybe it was, and I'd just been too blind to see it. I left the coffee shop in a daze, the folder tucked under my arm like a ticking time bomb. Every step toward my car felt heavier than the last. By the time I slid into the driver's seat, the anger hit me like a freight train. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, the sound of the horn echoing through the parking lot. How could she? How could the woman I'd built my life with, the mother of my children, do this? I thought back to every moment we'd shared. Our wedding day, the birth of our daughters, the countless nights we'd stayed up talking about our dreams. Were all of those moments lies? The worst part was realizing how little I'd known her. Or maybe I'd known her all along but refused to see the truth. The signs were there. Her increasing distance, her late nights at work, the mysterious bank account. I'd ignored them because I trusted her. Because I loved her. I drove aimlessly for hours, the folder still sitting on the passenger seat like a silent accuser. When I finally pulled into the driveway, it was late. The house was dark except for the porch light, which cast an eerie glow over the front door. Fiona was asleep when I walked in, her breathing soft and even. I stood there for a moment, watching her. What do you do when the person you love becomes a stranger? When every memory you cherish turns into a question mark? The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this fester any longer. I wasn't going to sit silently while she continued to lie to me, to mock the life we'd built. She needed to know that I knew, and I needed to see her face when the truth finally came out. When the moment came to confront Fiona, I was calm. Too calm, maybe. I'd spent the night pacing the house after the girls went to bed, rehearsing every word I wanted to say. By morning, I wasn't sure whether I felt numb or laser-focused. Either way, there was no turning back. Fiona was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, flipping pancakes like it was any other Saturday. The smell of coffee filled the air, and Grace and Emily were laughing in the living room over some ridiculous show. It was a picture-perfect scene, exactly the kind of life I thought we'd built together. But now, it felt staged, like a set piece in a play where I didn't know my lines. "Morning," she said with a smile, glancing over her shoulder. "Pancakes are almost ready. You want eggs too?" I didn't answer. My hands tightened around the folder I'd been carrying all night. She noticed the tension immediately, her smile faltering. "Matthew? What's wrong?" I set the folder on the kitchen counter, right in front of her. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "What's this?" "Open it," I said, my voice steady. Too steady. She hesitated, glancing between me and the folder like she already knew what was inside. Finally, she flipped it open. The first photo was enough. Her face went pale, and the towel dropped from her hands. "Matthew, I can explain." "Don't." I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation for this." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Fiona's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came out. Instead, she closed the folder and pushed it aside, her shoulders sagging under the weight of what she knew was coming next. "How long?" I asked, my fists clenched at my sides. "How long have you been lying to me?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted toward the living room, where the girls' laughter had quieted. "Not here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not in front of them." I followed her into the den, shutting the door behind us. The walls suddenly felt closer, the air heavier. Fiona stood with her back to me, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said finally, her voice trembling. I never meant to hurt you. I laughed bitterly. Never meant to hurt me? You've been cheating on me with multiple men, Fiona. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what you said about me. That I'm just here. That our marriage is a convenience. Her shoulders shook, and for a moment, I thought she was crying. But when she turned to face me, her eyes were dry, defiant, even. You don't understand, she said. Do you have any idea how lonely I've been? How trapped I've felt? Lonely? I echoed, my voice rising. You were lonely, so you decided to betray me? To destroy our family? It's not that simple, she shot back. You stopped seeing me, Matthew. You stopped caring. You were so busy with work, with the girls, with everything else, that you forgot I existed. That's your justification? I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. Do you even hear yourself? I worked for this family. For you. To give you everything you wanted. What I wanted, she said quietly, was you, but you weren't there. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I wondered if she was right. Had I neglected her? Had I let the daily grind of life chip away at our connection? But then I remembered the photos, the texts, the laughter in those recordings. Whatever loneliness she felt didn't excuse what she'd done. It didn't excuse the lies. I went to the clinic, I said, my voice hard. Do you know what they told me? Gonorrhea, Fiona. I got gonorrhea from my wife of 15 years. And you want to tell me this is about loneliness? Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear. I didn't know, she stammered. I swear, I didn't know. I took a step closer, my anger boiling over. You didn't know? You put my health at risk. You put our family at risk. And for what? For some cheap thrill? For a string of men who mean nothing to you. She broke down then, sinking onto the couch with her head in her hands. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. Her apology felt hollow, like an echo in an empty room. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that there was still something salvageable between us. But I couldn't. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. This is over, I said, my voice cold. You're moving out. I've already started the divorce process. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face a mask of panic. Matthew, please, don't do this. Think about the girls. I am thinking about them, I said, and they deserve better than this, better than you. I turned and walked out, leaving her sobbing on the couch. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. For me, for Grace and Emily, for the future I now had to rebuild without her. The house felt emptier after Fiona moved out. It wasn't just her absence. It was the void left behind by the truth I could no longer ignore. Grace and Emily noticed, of course. I told them their mother was staying somewhere else for a while, carefully omitting the ugly details. They didn't press me for answers, but the questions lingered in their eyes. I knew those conversations were coming, and I dreaded them. The days blurred together as I focused on work and the girls. I told myself I was moving forward, but the betrayal lingered like a shadow. And then, late one night, the phone call came. It was past midnight when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The display showed an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, my gut already bracing for bad news. Mr. Carter? The voice on the other end was calm but clipped, the kind of tone doctors and police officers use when delivering news no one wants to hear. This is Officer Langley from the County Police Department. There's been an accident. The word accident hit me like a punch to the chest. For a moment, I couldn't speak. What kind of accident? I managed, my throat dry. Your wife, Fiona Carter, was involved in a car crash. She's been taken to Memorial General. Her condition is critical. Critical. The word echoed in my mind as I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur, my thoughts racing faster than the car. Anger, worry, guilt, they all collided in my chest. Despite everything she'd done, she was still the mother of my children. She was still Fiona. When I arrived, the sterile smell of the hospital hit me like a wall. The receptionist directed me to the ICU, where a nurse escorted me to Fiona's room. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Fiona lay motionless, tubes and wires snaking from her body. Her face was bruised, her left arm in a cast. She looked so small, so fragile. The doctor, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, introduced herself and explained Fiona's condition. She suffered multiple fractures and internal injuries, she said. We've stabilized her for now, but it's touch and go. Will she make it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated. It's too early to say. I nodded, my gaze fixed on Fiona. She looked nothing like the confident, defiant woman I'd confronted days ago. She looked broken. As I sat by her bedside, my emotions churned. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave her to face the consequences of her actions alone. But another part, a quieter, softer part, remembered the woman I'd loved for 15 years. The woman who had once been my everything. A nurse interrupted my thoughts. Mr. Carter, there's something else you should know. During her intake, we ran routine tests. The results indicate that your wife may be HIV positive. I froze, the words sinking in like stones. HIV positive? I echoed, my mind racing. Are you sure? It's a preliminary result, she said gently. We'll need to confirm it with additional testing. I didn't know what to say. The news hit me harder than I expected. Anger bubbled up again. Not just at Fiona, but at the situation. At the universe for piling on more chaos when I was already drowning. I thought of Grace and Emily, of what this would mean for them, for all of us. The next morning, I returned to the hospital with a manila envelope in hand. Inside were the divorce papers I'd finalized the day after our confrontation. The nurse led me back to Fiona's room, where she was awake but groggy. Her eyes fluttered open when I entered, and for a moment, she looked at me with something like hope. Matthew, she croaked, her voice weak. You came. I sat down, setting the envelope on the tray beside her bed. I came because this needs to be done, I said, my tone firm. I brought the divorce papers. It's time to end this. Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. Please, she whispered. Don't do this now. Not like this. Fiona, I said, leaning forward. This isn't about punishment. It's about moving on. For me. For the girls. For you. She sobbed quietly, her frailty making the moment almost unbearable. But I couldn't let myself waver. I had to draw the line. I'll make sure you're taken care of, I continued. You'll have your share of the assets, and the girls will visit when they're ready. But this marriage is over. She nodded slowly, the fight drained out of her. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice trembling. For everything. I know, I said, my tone softer now. But sorry doesn't change what happened. I left the hospital feeling lighter, though not entirely free. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had taken a step toward reclaiming my life. Filing for custody was the hardest decision I've ever had to make, but it was also the easiest. Grace and Emily needed stability, and after everything that had happened, I couldn't trust Fiona to provide it. The divorce papers were just the first step. Custody was the next battle, and it wasn't one I could afford to lose. The court hearings were grueling. Fiona's lawyer painted her as a woman who had made mistakes but was still a loving mother. My lawyer countered with the facts, the affairs, the reckless behavior, the STD that could have jeopardized my health and hers. It was ugly, the kind of spectacle I'd never imagined our family would become. But I stood my ground, not out of spite, but for Grace and Emily. When the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody, I felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I could now protect my daughters and give them the stability they needed. Sadness because it was another nail in the coffin of the life I thought we had. Breaking the news to the girls was delicate. We sat at the dining table one evening, the air thick with unspoken tension. Grace, always the perceptive one, spoke first. Is Mom coming back? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. No, sweetheart. Your mom and I have decided it's best for us to live separately, but you'll still see her. She loves you both very much. Emily's eyes welled with tears, and she clung to Grace, who held her little sister protectively. It broke my heart to see them like that, but I knew honesty was the only way forward. I promised them that no matter what, I would always be there for them. And I meant it. Fiona moved into an apartment not far from the house, funded by her share of our joint assets. She called the girls regularly, and they visited her on weekends, though their time with her was strained. They didn't say much, but I could see it in their eyes, the confusion, the hurt. They didn't understand how their mother, the woman who'd been their rock, could have caused so much upheaval. For me, adjusting to single fatherhood was a crash course in resilience. Mornings were a whirlwind of making breakfasts, packing lunches, and ensuring Emily didn't forget her homework. Afternoons meant juggling work calls while attending Grace's soccer games or helping Emily with her school projects. Evenings were for dinner, stories, and tucking them into bed, always with the promise that tomorrow would be better. The nights, though, were the hardest. Once the house was quiet and the girls were asleep, the loneliness crept in. I'd sit in the living room, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed, and wonder how we'd gotten here. But even in those moments, I found solace in the laughter and love my daughters brought into the house. They were my reason to keep going. Friends and family became an unexpected lifeline. My sister, Rachel, dropped by often with casseroles and advice, her no-nonsense attitude a steadying force. My parents, retired but spry, made it a point to visit every weekend, their presence a reminder that family could weather even the fiercest storms. Therapy became another cornerstone of our healing. I found a counselor who specialized in family dynamics, and while I initially resisted the idea of talking it out, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. Grace and Emily joined me for some sessions, their young voices bravely expressing fears and questions I hadn't even realized they were carrying. Together, we began to unpack the weight of Fiona's betrayal and find a way to move forward. Faith played a significant role as well. I returned to church, not out of desperation, but for the sense of community and hope it offered. Grace and Emily found comfort in the Sunday school program, and I found solace in the quiet moments of prayer. It wasn't about seeking answers. It was about finding strength. As the weeks turned into months, I started to see glimpses of a new normal. The girls laughed more often, their smiles less weighed down by the pain of the past. We found a rhythm, a routine that worked for us. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. One evening, as I was tucking Emily into bed, she looked up at me with those big, earnest eyes and said, "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Her question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate in my response. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, stroking her hair. "We're going to be okay. It might take some time, but we're going to be better than okay." As I left her room, I realized I wasn't just saying it for her. I was saying it for myself too. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. This was the beginning of something new. Not the life I had planned, but the life I was determined to build for my daughters and myself. And in that moment, I understood that new beginnings weren't about erasing the past. They were about finding the strength to carry it forward, one step at a time. Healing, I quickly learned, isn't a straight path. It's messy and unpredictable, full of good days where hope feels within reach, and bad days where the weight of everything threatens to pull you under. For me, the healing process began the moment I admitted that I couldn't do it alone. At first, I threw myself into fatherhood with single-minded determination. Grace and Emily were my anchors, their routines giving me purpose when my own felt fractured. Morning drop-offs, evening soccer practice, late-night homework sessions, every task became a small victory. But no amount of busy work could fully distract me from the silence that filled the house once they were asleep. The nights were the hardest. That's when the questions crept in, the ones I didn't have answers to. How had I missed the signs? Was there something I could have done to save my marriage? And the most painful question of all, was I enough for my daughters now that their family was broken? Eventually, I reached out for help. My sister, Rachel, had been gently nudging me toward therapy for weeks, and after much internal debate, I scheduled an appointment. Sitting in that small, softly lit office felt strange at first, like airing my deepest failures to a stranger. But my therapist, Dr. Reynolds, had a way of asking questions that made me confront truths I'd been avoiding. "Do you blame yourself for what happened?" she asked during one session. I hesitated, staring at the floor. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should have seen it coming. Maybe if I'd been more attentive, more present. Matthew, she interrupted gently, it's important to recognize that her actions were her choice. You didn't cause this. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For so long, I'd been carrying the burden of guilt, wondering if I'd failed as a husband. But as I continued therapy, I began to see things more clearly. Fiona's betrayal wasn't about me. It was about her choices, her flaws. That realization was both liberating and painful. Therapy also became a safe space for Grace and Emily to process their feelings. They were remarkably brave, speaking honestly about their confusion and hurt. Grace, ever the protector, admitted she felt like she had to be strong for her younger sister. Emily, on the other hand, confessed that she missed the way things used to be, even though she was angry at Fiona. I don't understand why she did it, Dad, Emily said during one session. Doesn't she love us anymore? The question broke my heart, but I answered as honestly as I could. Your mom loves you both very much, I said. But sometimes, adults make mistakes that hurt the people they care about. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they're human. Slowly, we began to rebuild trust and understanding as a family. Our evenings turned into a time of connection. We started a new tradition, family game nights on Fridays, complete with popcorn and laughter that felt a little freer each week. Grace and Emily even took on the task of teaching me how to make their favorite dishes, spaghetti carbonara and chocolate chip pancakes. I wasn't much of a cook, but we turned my failures into jokes, and those moments of shared joy became the foundation of our healing. Faith also played a crucial role in our journey. I returned to church not out of obligation, but because I craved a sense of community and purpose. Grace and Emily thrived in the youth programs, finding friends who supported them during this difficult time. And for me, Sunday mornings became a moment of quiet reflection, a chance to lay my worries down and focus on the bigger picture. Friends and family rallied around us, reminding me that we weren't alone. My parents, bless them, became regular fixtures in our lives. They took the girls on weekend outings, giving me time to catch my breath. Rachel, as blunt and fiery as ever, made it her mission to drag me out of the house occasionally, whether I liked it or not. You need to start living again, Matthew, she said one evening over coffee. Not just for the girls, but for yourself. At first, I resisted. The idea of moving forward felt disloyal, as if healing meant erasing everything that had come before. But as the months passed, I realized Rachel was right. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant honoring the past while building something new. One evening, as I tucked Emily into bed, she asked me, "Are you happy, Dad?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm getting there," I said honestly. "It's a process, but we're going to be okay." She nodded, satisfied with my answer, and drifted off to sleep. As I stood there watching her, I realized that healing wasn't just about me. It was about creating a home where my daughters felt safe and loved, where they could grow without the weight of the past holding them down. And slowly but surely, we were getting there. It was Grace's idea. Well, hers and Rachel's, though I'm convinced the two of them were conspiring against me in the name of helping Dad move on. One Sunday after church, Grace came bounding into the kitchen, her eyes alight with that determined sparkle-eyed come to associate with her best ideas, or worst. "Dad, there's someone you should meet," she said, trying to sound casual, but her grin gave her away. "Meet?" I raised an eyebrow, pretending not to notice Rachel lurking behind her, trying and failing to look inconspicuous. "What are you two up to?" "Nothing. It's just," Grace faltered, looking at Rachel for backup. Rachel, never one to mince words, jumped in. "It's time you started putting yourself out there, Matthew. You're not getting any younger and frankly, you've moped around long enough." "I haven't been moping," I protested, though I knew it wasn't entirely true. My days revolved around the girls, work, and the slow, steady grind of rebuilding our lives. I hadn't thought much about dating, or at least, I'd convinced myself I hadn't. Grace chimed in again, her voice softer now. "We just want you to be happy, Dad. You deserve that." Her words struck a chord. For months, I'd been so focused on their happiness, their healing, that I hadn't stopped to consider my own. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was time to take a step forward, even if it felt terrifying. The church coffee shop was bustling with the post-service crowd when Rachel dragged me over, insisting I just say hello to a woman she described as perfect for you. I rolled my eyes but followed her, half curious and half dreading whatever setup she'd arranged. That's when I saw Rachel talking to someone across the room. A woman with auburn hair pulled into a loose bun, a warm smile lighting up her face as she spoke to a teenage girl who looked just like her. They were laughing over something, and the sight was so natural, so genuine, that I couldn't help but smile too. "Matthew, this is Rachel, no relation," my sister said with a grin as she gestured toward the woman. "Rachel, meet my brother, the reluctant optimist." Rachel, the other Rachel, looked up at me with kind, curious eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Matthew," she said, extending a hand. "Your sister's been telling me all about you." I shot Rachel a look, but she just shrugged, unapologetic. "All good things, I promise," the other Rachel added with a laugh. We spent the next few minutes chatting, small talk about the service, the weather, our kids. It turned out Rachel was a widow raising her teenage daughter, Lila, on her own. As we spoke, I found myself relaxing, the awkwardness melting away. There was an ease to her presence, a quiet strength that felt comforting. The girls, of course, were thrilled. Grace and Emily immediately took to Lila, bonding over a shared love of music and a mutual disdain for algebra. Watching them laugh together reminded me of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. After that initial meeting, Rachel and I found excuses to talk more. Coffee after church turned into the occasional lunch, then a walk through the park. We discovered we had a lot in common: our love for family, our shared experiences of loss, and a determination to move forward without forgetting where we'd been. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, Rachel asked, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like, this wasn't the plan, but here you are?" "All the time," I admitted. "But I guess the plan doesn't always work out the way we expect." She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I used to think moving on meant letting go of the past, but now I realize it's more about making room for the future, for whatever comes next." Her words stayed with me long after that night. Rachel wasn't just someone who understood my pain. She was someone who made me believe there could be more to life than what I'd lost. The first time I invited her over for dinner, I was nervous. Grace and Emily had insisted on helping, turning our kitchen into a chaotic whirlwind of laughter and spaghetti sauce. By the time Rachel and Lila arrived, the table was set, the food was, mostly, edible, and the house felt warm in a way it hadn't in a long time. The evening was filled with easy conversation and laughter. Watching Rachel interact with the girls, her patience with Emily's endless questions, her ability to make Grace laugh even when she was being stubborn, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. After they left, Grace gave me a knowing look. "You like her? Is it that obvious?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Very," she said, grinning. "And it's okay, Dad. She makes you happy. That's what matters." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what Grace had said. Happiness. It felt like such a distant concept, something I hadn't dared to hope for. But now, with Rachel, it didn't feel so far away. Maybe this was the start of something new. A new chapter, not just for me, but for all of us. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to turn the page. Our first official date wasn't anything grand. No fancy dinners or elaborate plans. Just Rachel and me, sitting across from each other at a quiet cafe, sipping coffee and talking about everything and nothing. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't weighed down by the past. I wasn't Matthew, the betrayed husband, or the single dad trying to keep it together. I was just me. Rachel had this way of making the world feel lighter. She laughed easily, not in the forced, polite way people sometimes do, but with genuine warmth that made you feel like you were in on a private joke. We talked about our kids, our jobs, the things we'd lost, and the small victories we'd found along the way. There was no pretense, no need to impress each other, just an honest connection. At one point, she tilted her head and asked, "So, what made you finally say yes to this date? Was it Grace and Rachel's relentless scheming, or did you secretly want it all along?" I chuckled, feeling a bit exposed. A little of both, I admitted. I think I needed a nudge. It's been a long time since I've thought about this. This? She teased, raising an eyebrow. You know, I said, gesturing vaguely. Dating? Starting over? The whole thing? Her smile softened. It's scary, isn't it? Putting yourself out there again after everything. Terrifying, I said honestly. But sitting here now, it doesn't feel so bad. She reached across the table and touched my hand lightly. That's because you're not doing it alone. That simple gesture, her hand on mine, was enough to make my chest tighten. It wasn't just about her touch. It was about what it meant. For so long, I'd been carrying everything on my own, too afraid to let anyone in. But with Rachel, it felt safe to try. When the check came, she insisted on splitting it. We're both starting over, she said with a grin. Might as well do it on equal footing. I walked her to her car afterward, the cool night air wrapping around us. For a moment, we stood there in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Then she turned to me, her eyes searching mine. I had a really nice time tonight. Me too, I said, and I meant it. We said goodnight without a kiss, not because I didn't want to, but because it felt right to take things slow. As I watched her drive away, I realized I was smiling. A real, unguarded smile. It felt like a small victory. When I got home, Grace and Emily were waiting for me, clearly more interested in the date than they'd been in their homework. How was it? Grace asked, leaning against the kitchen counter with a knowing smirk. Did you kiss her? Emily blurted out, earning a sharp Emily from her sister. I laughed, shaking my head. It was nice. And no, I didn't kiss her. Emily looked mildly disappointed, while Grace just nodded, satisfied. Good, she said. She seems like someone worth taking your time with. Their approval meant more than I could say. I knew how much they'd been through, how hard it must have been for them to see me start over. The fact that they were rooting for me, that they liked Rachel, made all the difference. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I found our rhythm. We didn't rush things, but every moment we spent together felt like another piece of my life falling into place. We had dinner a few times, went for walks, and even took the kids out together once. Watching Grace, Emily, and Lila bond was like watching sunlight break through clouds. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through photos on my phone. There was one from our last outing, a candid shot of Rachel and Lila laughing while Emily tried to teach Grace some ridiculous TikTok dance. I stared at it for a long time, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Rachel and I talked often about the challenges of blending families, about how we'd take things one step at a time. There's no rush, she said one night as we walked through the park. We don't have to have all the answers right now. Her patience was a gift I didn't know I needed. With her, there was no pressure to be perfect, no expectation to move faster than I was ready. It was just us, figuring it out together. One evening, after another simple but perfect dinner, Rachel stood on my front porch, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. The girls were inside, giggling over a movie, their laughter spilling out into the night. Thank you for tonight, she said softly. It's nice to feel normal again. Normal is underrated, I said with a smile. She laughed, her breath visible in the cool air. You're not so bad, Matthew Carter. Before I could respond, she leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment, just a quiet, tender kiss that felt like a promise. When she pulled back, she smiled. Good night. Good night, I said, watching as she walked to her car, my heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. And for the first time, the future didn't feel so scary. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be standing in my kitchen, cooking dinner with Rachel while our kids laughed together in the living room, I would have called them crazy. But here we were, messy, chaotic, and somehow, absolutely perfect. Blending our families wasn't without its challenges. Grace and Emily, while thrilled to see me happy, had their moments of adjustment. Grace, ever the protector, worried about what this new chapter meant for us. Emily, on the other hand, was quick to embrace the change, but she sometimes struggled with sharing me. Lila had her own hesitations, unsure of how Rachel's relationship with me would affect her bond with her mom. It wasn't always smooth, but we navigated it together, one conversation at a time. Rachel and I had plenty of late-night talks about how to make it work. "There's no playbook for this," she said one night as we sat on the couch, sipping tea after the girls had gone to bed. "We're going to make mistakes, but as long as we're honest with each other, we'll figure it out." Her words grounded me. Honesty. That was the foundation we were building on. After everything I'd been through, I realized how much I valued the simple act of telling the truth, of being vulnerable even when it was uncomfortable. Rachel brought that out in me, and I like to think I did the same for her. We didn't rush into anything. Even after months of dating, Rachel and Lila kept their own place, and we spent weekends alternating between our homes. It gave us space to adjust, to test the waters of what a blended life might look like. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, of unspoken tension, but we approached them with patience and grace. One weekend, the girls convinced us to take a family trip to the local lake. It was one of those crisp autumn days where the air was cool but the sun was warm, and the world felt alive with color. Watching the kids paddle around in canoes while Rachel and I sat on the dock, sharing a thermos of coffee, I realized how far we'd come. It wasn't just about finding happiness again. It was about creating a new kind of happiness, one built on resilience and hope. The moment that solidified it for me came one evening when Grace came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Dad," she said, her voice careful, "do you think this is it? Like, with Rachel and Lila?" I dried my hands and turned to face her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, do you think we're going to be like a family? For real?" Her question hit me harder than I expected. I crouched down to meet her eye level. "Grace, I know this hasn't been easy for you and Emily, and I can't promise that everything will be perfect. But what I can promise is that I love you and your sister more than anything. And I care about Rachel and Lila too. I want this to work, but it'll only work if we do it together." She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think it can work," she said softly. That was all the encouragement I needed. As the months passed, our lives intertwined in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rachel and I started talking about the future, not in abstract terms, but concrete plans. What it would look like if we combined households, how we'd navigate parenting together, what traditions we'd create as a family. On Christmas Eve, surrounded by the warm glow of the tree and the laughter of our daughters, I took Rachel's hand and held it tight. "I think we're doing it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "Doing what?" "Building a life. Together." She squeezed my hand, her voice full of quiet certainty. "We are." And in that moment, I knew we were ready. Ready to take the next step, whatever it might be. Ready to face whatever challenges came our way. Ready to embrace the future, not as two families trying to fit together, but as one.